You all, thank you so much for coming tonight and joining us. It is a beautiful day, but for most of us, it started with scraping the windshield, which was unexpected. My poor plants in the garden, I hope they have survived this. So welcome everybody. We're gonna get started. So for tonight's presentation, we have Jessica Clary, and she is going to talk to us about EMDR and specifically racially focused EMDR. So we're going to start with a quick introduction, and then I'm going to hand it over to Jessica to start us off. But Jessica is a licensed clinical social worker who practices trauma-focused therapy through an anti-racist and inclusivity-centered lens here in Virginia. She's worked in the field of mental health and substance use for over 10 years. Jessica is very passionate about racial, social, and criminal justice activism, removing hierarchy and decentering whiteness. And these values have led her to building skills to include race-focused EMDR that support navigating these realities within the therapy setting. So we're super excited to have her here tonight. And Jessica, I'm going to hand it off to you. And before I do that, I'm going to share my screen with everybody.
All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. I'm glad that you were able to join us this evening. So we are here to talk about EMDR, and I will introduce EMDR a little bit. And then we will talk about racism, and then we're going to integrate the two of those together kind of towards the end of the presentation. So, just a brief introduction about myself and kind of the history that I come from. I have my undergraduate degree in health sciences, which really focused on health education and public health. And I got that from the University of Alaska, and I did live there. So, the population and gaining the knowledge and perspective of communities and what it looks like to be in communities really stemmed from that and led into the clinical social work degree from Simmons, and now currently as an adjunct instructor here at VCU and outpatient therapy. I want to just give us a positionality statement here at the beginning. I understand the irony. I understand the privilege of me coming in and talking about racism and how to address racism. And so I always like to take a moment to just acknowledge the inherent impact that my identity has on this work, that it has on this presentation. And that's both professionally and personally within the communities and spaces that I show up in or advocate for. So we can talk about the objectives next. So we will start with an introduction to EMDR and what that is, kind of go over the 8 phases of it a bit. We're going to talk about why race is important in the therapeutic process and ultimately how that intersects with EMDR. As we know, racism is traumatic. I'm going to talk about the approach to EMDR that I use, which is somatic-based EMDR, and some methods for practicing that. And then we're going to bring those together and kind of talk about some practical skills for integrating the racially focused EMDR aspects into that intervention. So, what is EMDR? EMDR stands for eye movement desensitization reprocessing. And we can go to that next slide there. So EMDR was developed by Dr. Francine Shapiro in 1987. She was a psychologist in California and essentially discovered EMDR by accident. The story was that she was upset about something and decided to take a walk. And on this walk, she was moving her eyes side to side, kind of following the lines on the sidewalk, and noticed that she felt better sooner than she anticipated. And so this prompted the research, and the initial positive results for EMDR were published a couple of years later in 1989. So her initial research focused on eye movement for trauma survivors, and later tapping and sounds were added as methods of desensitization. And ultimately, the 8 phases of EMDR were born from there. And so since that slide is up, we will shift into that slide. So you can see the 8 phases here. I'll start with the first one, so history taking and treatment planning. This is the typical intake that you would engage in with all clients, right? And for those seeking EMDR specifically, we might be asking questions that focus more on the symptoms that encourage them to seek out EMDR in the first place and explore how those symptoms are impacting functioning. So we would want to administer the DES-2, which is a scale that explores the presence and or the severity of dissociative symptoms. The screen isn't being shared anymore. There we go. Um, for clients that score in the high range on that DES-2 scale, we would want to be sure that we increase the grounding techniques to support that client with safety and effectiveness with EMDR. And we also want to assess for internal and external resources here in this initial intake. So looking at and asking about what coping skills that they have, what supports do they have, do they believe in a higher power? Do they have ancestors that they talk to and find comfort in doing so? These would be extra questions that we would want to make sure that we lean into maybe a little bit more than we would in a standard intake when we know that client is seeking EMDR services. The second phase, preparation, this is where we're going to talk about education on what EMDR is with that client, as well as realistic expectations. We would talk about the risks and the possible benefits of EMDR, and consideration should be included in this step, especially if they're involved in like a legal case. We would want to talk to them about how participating in EMDR could change their responses to that legal case or what had happened, and that could ultimately impact them. So we want to make sure that they have the full knowledge of what could potentially happen, even though we don't know exactly what would happen, so that they can make the best choice for them as to the timing. And expectations are important to explore here because if any of you practice EMDR, you might know that clients come straight in, they want to go straight into the tapping and solving the problems, usually because they saw something about EMDR on TikTok. And so pacing clients and kind of teaching them skills and safety first is definitely a big part of that preparation phase. Building trust and rapport is also really essential in that stage, addressing client questions and concerns that they might have about what EMDR is and what it can do, and then helping them build specific skills that can support them. I have found that DBT is a great foundation for EMDR. So if they're interested or you feel like they could benefit from DBT, because of that focus on teaching them ways to identify their emotions and how to engage with distress tolerance and emotion regulation. And those things integrate really well when we're trying to prepare a client to identify those somatic feelings within their body. During this phase, we also want to inform clients that there isn't a specific timeline in which they will begin the processing or when they will start tapping, so to speak. We can't give them an exact time frame because highlighting that their safety is first and foremost is really important. So it's going to look different no matter who it is that you treat. Some of them are going to inherently have more skills and be ready to go sooner, whereas others may take a little more time to build that. In my experience, individuals are often distressed and want to not be distressed. And they don't necessarily know about the steps that come before. And so teaching them about the phases, that it's not just about the desensitization, can be really helpful. For the third phase assessment, this is where the client will identify the traumatic event that they want to work on. So that could include images that they find disturbing, beliefs, feelings, sensations that they have in their body. And we want to find a way to inform the client that we don't necessarily need to hear them walk through the event in full detail to support them. So, kind of an analogy that I would give is we want the movie poster image, a preview if necessary, but not the whole movie. I have found that some people haven't really done the talk therapy piece, or they don't feel like they've necessarily had the space or the validation for those experiences yet. And so sometimes talk therapy is what they want first before they're ready to jump into giving you that movie poster image and giving you something to focus on. The fourth phase is desensitization. This is where we get to the processing by the method identified by the client. So this could be the traditional methods, eye movement by following fingers or a light bar. This could be buzzers or sound, or the somatic methods, which involve the client engaging and connecting with their own body. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that looks like later in the presentation. The fifth phase, installation. Once the processing is complete, this step involves the positive belief that the client wants to associate with that traumatic target event that they just worked through moving forward. So this would be installed until it feels completely true to that client, whatever that positive belief is that they've identified. And during this phase, they may want to change that at some point, and that's okay too. And we'll talk a little bit more about this phase as well, especially from a racial perspective later in the presentation. Phase 6 is body scanning. This step allows the client to really integrate that original image and the positive belief and scan for any additional disturbances that need to be processed. The seventh phase is closure. Closure is where there's no longer any disturbances and the special place grounding technique would be used. And the final phase is reevaluation. So in future sessions, this would look like you exploring with the client any new insights that they've had, any thoughts, feelings, or memories that they feel like have come to light to help ensure that that disturbance remains low or eliminated. And if it ever is to reoccur, then we can kind of enter back in the stage that or the phase that feels appropriate. I want to give an opportunity for any questions before we talk a little bit about the next part here, which is how racism shows up inside and outside of the therapy space. Um, any questions?
Are we going to be called on, or should we just go ahead and shoot from the hip?
You can go ahead.
Okay. You were talking about skills on behalf of the client. What were you referring to specifically as far as skills are concerned?
In regards to coping skills and making sure they have skills for safety.
Okay, that's what you're referring to. As far as the somatic versus light bar methods, do you find that there are varieties or modalities that are more effective for certain types of trauma or experiences, or is it based on the preferences or needs of the client?
It's just based on the preferences of the client. Some clients do better when they're able to engage somatically. Other clients do better when they have something to follow. I notice that for clients who have ADHD, sometimes the somatic methods or having their eyes closed is really boring and they struggle to keep focus. And so a light bar in that instance may be a better fit for them.
Okay, so you haven't found that like any type of trauma maps onto a certain type of light bar versus somatic.
Not in my experience. Also, I primarily practice somatic EMDR, and so most clients seek me out for that reason. I have never used a light bar myself, but I've never seen in any research or in any presentations that I've attended that one is necessarily more effective for a certain type of trauma or another.
And risk associated, you were mentioning risk. I'm curious.
So, EMDR is distressing. It can bring up a lot of feelings somatically. It can bring up a lot of emotions. It can trigger suicidal ideation. It can impact sleep. It can produce more memories or nightmares or hypervigilance. And so we want to make sure that a client is aware that those things could happen. We also want to give them a plan in case any of those things do happen so they kind of know how to process that and whether that looks like reaching out to you as someone who could continue to support them with safety, or if it looks like um, having other supports in their life, be aware of what it is that they're doing. There's a number of things that we could do from there.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I had a question of the trauma and the process that you had just explained. Is it one trauma in every single phase, or is it kind of like as you go throughout their lifeline? What does that look like?
So for the desensitization, this is going to be one target at a time.
Okay.
So as you're trained in EMDR, you kind of learn about different methods for um, desensitization, whether it's like recent traumatic protocol, whether um, we're doing the flow back. There's other methods that we could use, but essentially we focus on one target at a time, even if we're focusing on a line of targets that are connected. And so ultimately, it's not, I'm going to process all of my feelings of abandonment in this one moment, right? It's going to be broken down into specific things that they've identified as being traumatic for them. Does that answer your
Got you.
question?
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Any other questions? You can feel free to shout them out just because I can't quite tell. I see some in the chat here. Okay. All right, perfect. So if there's no other questions here, we can go to the next slide and the next slide. Perfect, thank you. All right, so thinking about how racism shows up both inside and outside of the therapy space, I wanted to spend some time talking about some key points. This presentation specifically is going to be focused on anti-Black racism. And while I understand that racism can impact other groups of people who have been marginalized, um, Black Americans are particularly at risk of the mental and physical health impacts of racism due to the history of this country, oppressive systems that have been in place, and a continuation of anti-Black rhetoric wearing different hats over the decades. So, first, I'd like to talk about the difference between racism and prejudice. The primary is that racism is accompanied by power, whereas prejudice is discriminations and judgments and doesn't inherently have that power associated with it. So as a result, white people cannot experience racism. They can experience prejudice. And so having those conversations and having that information is a good foundation. But when considering how experiences with racism show up in the therapeutic space, it's important to address power differentials and address race first, especially if you are a white provider. Does anyone want to share how they may have done this before? If you've ever done this, kind of addressing power differentials or race in the start of your work with someone, and feel free to just speak out. And if not, that's okay. I'll talk about some ways that you can do that. So I'll give you an example of how I've done this back when I used to do intensive in home. For those of you that may not know what that is, essentially you're going into the community and into clients' homes, working with children and their families. And so you're really in intimate spaces with them, right? You're getting to see how they live, they're letting you in their home, and there's a lot that comes with that. And so I would sit down and on the first meeting, if those clients were of a different race than me or a different ethnicity than me, it would be one of the first things that I say, like, okay, how do you feel? Here I am, a white woman sitting on your couch with a notebook and a pen. What does this bring up for you? What is this like? And throughout the years of doing that, there's a number of responses that I've received or seen. And sometimes it's shock or kind of a freeze, like, oh, wait, what? This white woman is bringing up race with me? Huh? It's new, it's different. Sometimes there's an immediate response to try to protect my feelings. And that looks like, I don't worry about that, or I don't mind, I don't see that. Right. And so even addressing that and using that to kind of start conversations around what that looks like. What does it look like for them to have to protect white feelings in so many spaces? And think about how the systems of racism have thrived in the protection of white feelings. So the safety of bringing up racial related experiences is not inherently there. And that can feel uncomfortable for the client. So we want to work on building the relationship where safety fosters an environment where white feelings and systems of white supremacy are not at the center. Racism occurs in personal experience and collective experiences. So some clients may struggle to identify personal experiences of racism, but can usually start by identifying collective experiences, such as those that we've seen on a more national level or even within their communities. I also want to touch on epigenetics here too, just briefly. Um, but I want to see if any of you feel like you could share a little bit about epigenetics and what that means or what you might know about that.
I've heard the term before, but I don't actually remember what it means.
That's fair. Thanks for saying so.
Yeah.
Um, is it to do with like kind of the research projects that have happened? Kind of thing, like, yeah, like with like trying to make the perfect race in a sense.
Oh, eugenics. That's
Oh,
eugenics.
eugenics. Okay. All right. I got
Very,
it.
I see where those get mixed up for sure.
Yeah, I couldn't
Um,
remember. Okay, thank you.
yeah, of course. So in the chat, someone said DNA shaped through generational trauma. And yes, essentially. Epigenetics is the research that supports that trauma impacts gene expression without altering underlying genetic sequence. So this means that a child would hold the trauma of their mother and grandmother in their bodies because they at one point they all shared the same body. And thus they can be more susceptible to the impacts of said trauma to include the physical health and the mental health factors. It means that they could react to things that they themselves have not personally experienced. And so when we think about how racism shows up, racism isn't going to look like one specific thing. And on the next slide, we're going to get into more specific details of the types of racism. So if we can, there we go. So here's some visuals here, and we'll talk about them individually. So systemic racism, which encompasses institutional and structural racism, which we see on the right-hand side of that chart on the left. This focuses really on discriminatory policies, so like hair and dress codes, what is and isn't considered professionalism, access to resources. Devaluation falls here, and we can think about the birth of Black Lives Matter really coming from this side and focusing on these systems, excuse me. Devaluation is the underestimating or devaluing of someone's worth, which would be based in assumptions and beliefs, not facts. And so assuming that what someone wears relates to their education level or their abilities, or a Black woman becoming the face of welfare instead of a white woman, who were indeed the primary recipients of government assistance programs when they first began. These were examples of systemic racism. This is what you were meant to see. This is designed this way to be able to create these harmful anti-Black narratives and continued rhetoric of racism that continues. Structural racism specifically looks at laws that support or further aid in unjust advantages. So ideology, I got it. The ideology of lifting yourself up by your bootstraps kind of thing, that would fall here. The Black on Black crime narrative, that would fall here. The way that substances are classified criminally to support marginalizing some groups over others. Disenfranchisement of Black families with the school to prison pipeline, mass incarceration, and the invisible tax. All of that falls under the structural racism category. And the invisible tax is really what highlights the way that I call it the criminal injustice system rather than justice system, disproportionately impacts Black families and is essentially designed for recidivism. So if you want to learn more about those things that I just spoke about, I can recommend the documentaries and stories of the Waverly Two, Terrence and Farron's story, When They See Us, and the Khalif Browder story, both of which are on Netflix, and the Color of Innocence series and the Prison Policy Initiative. Both of those can be found on social media. And you can see the two charts on the right there are from the Prison Policy Initiative. They're a great resource if you're interested in learning more about that. Interpersonal racism, which is kind of where we see the two merge in the middle. It's its own type of racism, but has those intersections, right? So this type of racism is often what is thought about or referenced when discussing racism. So this can be overt acts of racism like threats, violence, or microaggressions, which microaggressions is just a word we use to maybe say something is more subtle, but essentially it's just a way to deny that it's in fact aggressive. There's nothing micro about it. But we don't want to allow us to necessarily think that it lacks violence just because we call it microaggression. But this would look like racism disguised as jokes or poor boundaries, like believing that you can touch people without their permission. And then internalized racism. This is when the person that's been impacted by racism internalizes those racist narratives and observations that they've been exposed to and applies them to themselves in forms of beliefs or beauty standards or prejudices against people within their own communities. I want to briefly mention explicit and implicit bias because this is really important when we were talking about how does this show up in therapy as well. So explicit biases are conscious, right? These are racial slurs. This is hate speech. This is the promotion of division. Whereas implicit bias, this is unconscious. These are unconscious preferences, often shaped by stereotypes and racism. Confirmation bias furthers as you continue to behave in a way that confirms the internal beliefs. And this can come out in like nonverbal behaviors. So that might be changing your tone or the language that you would typically use when you are around Black people or people of color versus other groups, and maybe how you speak there. This might look like assuming that someone's accent or dialect depicts their education level or what they can contribute. We can go to that next slide, please. So the next slide has some good images that you can take a look at as I talk about them a little bit further. I would assume that most of us have been trained around the appeasing keywords of cultural competence, trauma-informed, awareness of biases and privileges. And while there is space for these words and concepts, these are foundational. The reality is that's not enough, and we can't stop there. So coming back to anti-racism as a verb and not as a noun. Um, we don't want to just do the thing for the checkbox for the annual training, so to speak. We want to take a moment and opportunity to reflect on where we feel we are and what it means to be anti-racist. And I think that chart there on the left is really helpful because some of you might find yourself predominantly in one particular section, whereas others might see that you're a little bit here and there. And so when addressing racism and the impacts on individuals, whether that be with EMDR or other treatment modalities, it's important that work is done with you as the provider, as the clinician, with consistent engagement in what it means to have anti-racist behaviors as a verb. And I want to touch base on how the types of racism discussed in the previous slides, specifically systemic and interpersonal, can show up in social work and in the therapy space. So with systemic racism, which we know consists of both institutional and structural racism, the policies and the development of social work was intertwined and complicit with white supremacy from its conception. And this includes colonizing ideology and even how we diagnose with the DSM-5. This looked like minimizing the contributions of Black women on the field and giving credit to names that Jane Addams or Mary Richmond as being foundational to social work. And oftentimes, even if you go to Google, the founder of social work, you're going to see those two names as major contributions. But the names that you're not going to see, most likely, unless you're really looking, is Mary Church Terrell and Ida B. Wells and Thyra J. Edwards, just to name a few, who were also significantly contributing to what we understand as social work today in the communities that they were in, often being resourceful and challenging those systems that were oppressive. We can also think about the development of the American Psychiatric Association, which focuses on specific American research and diagnoses, which essentially creating the American diagnosis. And while they are required, it's still a requirement to use the ICD-11 codes that align with the World Health Organization. The APA has its own diagnosis system and does not acknowledge some of the diagnoses from the World Health Organization, such as complex PTSD. So these diagnoses that we're using, right, are determined and are used to determine how people are treated, labeled, judged, and it creates disparities and limitations in the system of capitalism, such as insurance premiums or denials. When there weren't protections against pre-existing conditions, a higher premium or denial of life insurance, and medical racism and biases that dismiss individuals' experiences and symptoms, especially when they have certain diagnoses that carry a higher level of stigma, whether that be bipolar or borderline personality disorder. Prior to the development of DMDD, so disruptive mood dysregulation disorder, many Black children were diagnosed with bipolar, and there was often little to no consideration that was established around the impacts of systemic racism and what that does, right? And the symptoms that are inherent and going to happen and are now labeled as disordered instead of looking at the impacts of those systems and the environments on the people in which they're impacting. So when we think about the populations in the studies for even the basis of effectiveness of interventions and what we see or describe as evidence-based, they have historically been white and more often men than women. And there has been a vast dismissing of what marginalized communities would communicate as being effective and culturally centering for them. When we think about the policies that harmed Black and Brown communities, to include like the biases in the child welfare system and having stricter regulations for Black and Brown families, We could be talking about coercive mental health treatments and forced sterilization, and even talking about social work's participation in Indigenous residential schools and segregated settlement homes, and even advocating for theories of eugenics, which someone mentioned earlier. Interpersonal racism in social work might look a little bit different and showing up in the therapy spaces. So I want to give that its own section here. But this might look like having preconceived notions of someone based on their insurance type, or complimenting someone's English, or saying you are so well spoken. It might be being surprised if a Black individual has married parents or higher education, or assuming that a Black man must be a drug dealer if he has a nice car. These biased thoughts and preconceived notions around Black culture can lead to those implicit biases, can lead to how you may show up in a therapeutic space, even if it's not something that is said out loud. But part of anti-racism as a verb is being able to recognize those things within yourself and figuring out what is next, right? We also want to highlight preconceived notions about other aspects of Black culture, such as grills or locks or bonnets, and labels and narratives that we see or hear around that could be impacting the way we perceive clients or communities as a whole. We could see this in an assessment. So there's historically a lot more experiences of Black women at their intakes being labeled as angry or resistant, without considering the context and a lack of trust being built up to that point. Providing diagnoses or mental health status exams based on the feelings of the clinician and their own internal emotional responses or expressions. This could look like believing that someone isn't telling the truth if their experience and what they're expressing is outside of what your known experience has been or what your experience has been within a specific population. And so in those cases, we are believing that it is us who knows best, and we are the experts instead of seeing individuals as the experts of their own lives and the experiences that they have had. Voting for the individuals in the current administration, claiming to not see color or not doing politics, so to speak, are all ways that interpersonal racism exists and would impact the trust and the relationship that could potentially be built within your therapeutic relationships with clients. We can go to that next slide there, and then I'll leave an opportunity for questions in just a second. So I'd like to share some of these resources with you. So these are some books that I would recommend for those of you who are wanting to learn more about different systems or how this could even impact the way you show up in therapy. And talk a little bit about what does it look like to engage in anti-racist actions in the therapy space. So this looks like not being neutral. There is a right and a wrong answer here. And when you take this neutral stance, what you are saying is it is safe for protecting the feelings of some people, but not protecting the feelings of those who are being marginalized by these policies, and making a safe space for their experiences. This looks like ongoing self-reflection, questioning where your own thoughts and beliefs come from, and identifying ways that your privileges have benefited you. This is about keeping racial identity and privileges at the forefront to mitigate and address any biases that may be present and challenge them. So kind of coming back to what I mentioned earlier, addressing those power dynamics in the therapeutic relationship. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in the upcoming slides where we merge these concepts together. Being client-centered in a way that supports the client to talk about their experiences in being marginalized and acknowledging this to potentially be different than your experience. You want to be sure that The white experience is not the center measuring point of the experiences of others. So we don't want to minimize or excuse or explain away someone's expressed experiences with racism that they trusted in bringing to you. It's also bringing up the systems in place that cause harm and sometimes providing education with validation on what this looks like. So you would want to be educated about the history of the systems in place to be able to support a client who has internalized these beliefs about themselves and help them separate their self-worth from the racism that exists around them. And if talking about race makes you uncomfortable, then this is an area for you to lean into and not avoid. Avoiding is a privilege. Choosing not to be involved is a privilege, and ultimately a disservice to the populations that you serve. This also looks like building a network with other providers who are also practicing anti-racism to support clients and being able to obtain safe and comprehensive care. So I want to share an experience of and a personal example of what that looks like in terms of building a network. So there was a psychiatric nurse practitioner that I met with and have since referred everyone to because of how she practices and feeling safe to send people there that I trust will be able to care for the people that I send her way. But when meeting this psychiatric nurse practitioner, there was another psychiatric nurse practitioner in that practice. And she said to me, "Hey, you can send some people to me too. I'm happy to see them." What I know is that I will never do that because while mingling in this mixer that we were attending, I heard her joke about a time in her life that she used to have dreadlocks. Her words, not mine. And if you guessed that this was a white woman, then you would be right. And so to openly discuss this and laugh about it and not see the issue here, that tells me enough about the safety of that particular person when it comes to race that I wouldn't want to refer people to her. And I'm not saying anything about her ability to practice as a psychiatric nurse practitioner. I don't know how she practices. The point is that in that moment, the individuals that I work with and the safety that I create in our relationship, it's really important that I have networks of people that I have the same level of trust with, because I'm sure we've heard from a lot of our clients the mistreatment and the judgments that they get, not just in psychiatric care, but in medical care as well. So thinking about, again, how to practice that anti-racism in the therapy space, it's important to remember that you're going to make mistakes. But if you avoid the work because of the fear of those mistakes, then what we are saying is that our personal comfort is more important than dismantling a system that doesn't work for everyone. So if you are addressed for an action that was racist, let's say someone calls you out, own it. Be accountable by accepting this and learning from it. What you don't want to do is say, well, that wasn't my intention, because intention and impact are not the same. And so when we think about being anti-racist, it's about doing what is just because it is just, not because you feel guilty. To focus on your guilt or your shame is to center whiteness. So in the therapy space, this is listening more and speaking less and not feeling like it is your job to save people. It is not expecting to be educated by your Black clients or other people of color. And it's not expecting acknowledgement and recognition for unlearning and relearning. Because essentially, racism is a white people problem. And we have to be able to address those systems to change them, to dismantle them, to start over. Also, I think another one of those key words that we hear is ally. You don't want to just be an ally. An ally isn't inherently effectively actionable. So some examples of this recently would be like wearing the blue bracelets to symbolize that you're someone who is safe. The safety pins on the shirts from several years ago, changing your profile picture to the black square. That was a trend back in 2020 following the police murder of George Floyd. which filled up feeds with all of these changes. And essentially, it inhibited people from seeing factual information and news and process footage and information for people who were on the ground at the time. So while it seemed like something that was helpful, essentially it was performative and harmful for people that otherwise were using social media to access information. So I know that was a lot of information. So I'd like to check in with everyone and give you a chance to ask any questions that you might have or any comments that you might have before we move into the next section, which will talk about the intersections of EMDR and racism.
Dylan.
What was the galvanizing, sorry, what was the galvanizing moment for you in terms of making this a focus of your practice and your study?
Well, I think a couple of things, really. One, I knew I wanted to be trained in EMDR, and I remember at the time when I was getting trained, I worked for someone else's practice. And so when she was choosing which EMDR training, so to speak, that we would go to, she found one that was called EMDR in color. And when we were reading the description, I was just like, I'm not sure this is for me. I'm not sure this is for white providers, and I don't want to show up in a space that isn't made or meant for me. And my boss and my supervisor at the time was a Black woman, and she was kind of like looking at me funny. But she reached out, and of course, they were like, nope, that's not what that means, and everyone's welcome. And so I really enjoyed the fact that this particular training, which I'll talk about a little more with you next, focused on Black communities and people of color because essentially these are communities that I'm often in. These are communities that often seek services. And outside of therapy, I've done a lot of grassroots activism and advocacy. And so being in those spaces, whether it be for criminal injustice cases or whether it be for the protests and organizations back in 2020, I think those two things really solidified what I felt like could be missing or what I wanted to at least be able to contribute to positively from an outpatient therapy space, which sometimes can be really disconnected from everything else that's going on. I hope that answered your question.
Does anybody have any other questions before we move on? Or comments?
Okay. We'll also have plenty of time at the end for more questions. So if something comes to mind, please feel free to hold that and we will definitely address it. So now we'll go into the next section, talking about how racism and EMDR come together as a practice, as an intervention. We can go to the next slide. There we go. So I talk about most of the phases here. There's a couple that I don't necessarily focus on specifically. But I do want to take some time to focus on phase one, which was the history taking portion. So during this phase of assessing client history, you would want to be sure to ask additional questions regarding their cultural background and the intersections of those backgrounds. We want to talk about their lived experiences and what and who they identify as or identify with as community. So their perception of their community and what helps foster or limit feelings of support in the community and with community members or social supports in their life. So this might be family, this might be friends, this might be religious groups or other supports in their life. We want to make sure that we identify who they see as their supportive community because that could be something that comes into play for them as part of like that coping and having natural supports to deal with what comes up with EMDR. We would also want to make sure that we explore grief and loss, ancestors they may have or had a close connection with, and why those people were important to them or to their family systems. When exploring religion as part of the intake, we want to ask if this is how they grew up or if this is something that they adopted when they were an adult. Did they have a transition or a change in their religious or spiritual practice? Um, and this might include asking questions relating to family rituals or family traditions that are important to them. This might be identifying community figures that may be important and worth identifying, like a pastor. And how do they view medicine? And what is their level of trust within the medical system? Because that also matters when we think about maybe some of the traumatic events that they might want to talk about, but also when we're thinking about where racism shows up. We want to make sure that we explore generational history in that intake and the storytelling. And the storytelling they may have heard growing up, right? Something that they've been able to repeat and they keep it with them, something that they see as important. And encourage reflection on the strength of their history or the pride that they might have in it. Are there healing practices that they practice as part of their upbringing? This could be medicinal, this could be prayer, this could be incense, this could be essential oils. This could be all sorts of things, but we want to make sure that we're asking to give them an opportunity to talk about that, which is probably not something that most people get to talk about, especially in an intake. We also want to remember to thank the client for what it is that they choose to share with us. They don't know you. So expressing that you value the trust that they are giving you helps to build that trust and rapport. This is one part of this work, I think, that continues to amaze me. The stories that I'm privileged to hold space for and the level to which people allow me to know them and to know their stories. It's truly an honor, I think, of this field and of this work, um, is to hold space for that. We can look at the next phase. So preparation, the next step of preparation. Sometimes you will have a client who has identified racism as a traumatic event in their life that they want to be able to address in EMDR. But in my experience, most clients don't think of this as being an option. So education can be given regarding this as being an option and the ability to focus on specific events and experiences or somatic feelings that they have when it comes to those experiences, or somatic feelings that they have even that just feel persistent in their life, right? When they talk about having chronic headaches or chronic stomach aches or feelings of hypervigilance, these are somatic feelings. These are things that we could focus on as targets. And we're looking at collective, historical, and cultural experiences. As with processing any traumatic event, the risks and benefits need to be explored. So when I mentioned the court case earlier, you know, we want to just make sure that if they are in an active court case, that they are in a place where if they were to not respond when someone was to repeat the events back to them, is that going to be okay? Is that going to help their case? Is that going to hurt their case? EMDR is not meant to suppress emotions that are effective and necessary. So identifying the ways that physical and mental health are interconnected is important here to discuss the ways that chronic cortisol released relating to stress or traumatic events and experiences with racism impacts health. And this could include autoimmune disease, heart conditions, sleep, hormones, etc. And we see that a little bit with the image here on the slide. This is exacerbated also by additional interactions that have been marginalized outside of just race, such as sex and poverty. So in this phase, I always want to review the trust and rapport building that happens. There's often understood and unspoken rules about trusting people outside of their community, especially white people. So bringing this up can be a helpful way to continue building validation and speaking about it. versus feeling passively silenced and dismissed, often reinforcing that oppressive system and centering whiteness. You want to also be sure to check in with yourself about assumptions that you may be making as part of that work. Go to the next slide. So in the assessment phase, this is where individuals are giving us the snapshots, right, of the traumatic events and experiences that they want to process in EMDR. So we can begin to further reflect that symptoms are intersections of identity that can be internalized, and we can explore those beliefs and the connection of social oppression to those internal. We also want to acknowledge and recognize that individuals may not be fully aware of the impacts of intergenerational and systemic violence and colonization. And so it's important that while this can be presented as an option, individuals may not be ready. They may not want to or may be weary of the process when it comes to addressing racism in EMDR or experiences with racism, because they don't know what this could bring up for them. And so we essentially want to make sure that we are listening to and validating what that individual wants and letting that be first, and not feeling like just because we know health and we know interventions that support people, it's not inherently a one size fits all. And you may find people who are ready later on, and you may find people who really aren't ready to unpack something that might feel so big to them, and that's okay. We can look at the next slide. So desensitization, the fourth phase here. What we know about trauma is that it is stored in the body. It's stored in the body as sensations, as somatic responses, not only or even predominantly as active memory. And some of the ways trauma shows up in physical health could look like pain, often chronic pain, poor sleep. Both of those things would also be somatic symptoms of how trauma could be impacting them in other ways outside of just an active memory of something. So focusing on somatic processing allows for the client to reconnect to their bodies and build a sense of safety and trust and control with themselves when processing the feelings of a time in which they didn't feel those things. They didn't feel in control. They didn't feel a sense of safety and trust. And so the somatic interventions, which is what I focus on, allows them to connect with their bodies, whereas trauma is often accompanied by dissociation. And dissociation, as we know, is the brain's ultimate means of protection. And individuals struggle with feeling grounded and present within their own bodies. And so oftentimes that's how people have survived up to this point, right? And so that disconnection from their bodies is there on top of perhaps fuzzy memories or feeling disconnected from communities. And so somatic and culturally relevant processing allows for that reintegration. Some of the somatic methods that can be used is butterfly tapping, which essentially would be a crossing of the hands here. It could be tapping legs. It could be tapping feet. It could be rocking from side to side. It could look like cultural or ritualistic dancing or body movement that involves moving from side to side, or other culturally meaningful items that could support somatic stimulation. So that might be drumming. That might be tapping to culturally rhythmic beats that have meaning to them or bring out positive somatic feelings. Resourcing is an intervention that can be used in EMDR for individuals who feel stuck in the process and need support in managing and changing their affect to self-soothe and be able to continue. A lot of clients will experience a block, and sometimes that's visual for them. They'll say there's like a black box here, or they can't go there. It feels like there's a barrier for them. And so resourcing is a skill that we use as part of EMDR to help individuals in that space. It's typically recommended that these not be the individuals when we're talking about resourcing for people that they know. We don't necessarily want them to pick resourcing of images of people who are alive in the present or people that they interact with, just because sometimes that blurs the emotional ties in the relationships with those people. And we want any sort of resourcing when they call someone in, so to speak, to ground them or help them feel safe again. We want those resources to be conflict free. And so we want to look for people that they may have an emotional connection with that isn't necessarily in their current circle. Culturally inclusive options that can be presented here include collective ancestors and the strength that may be found there, or specific ancestors that they know of through the family storytelling or in their family history. We can look at the next slide. So installation. Part of installation, right, is we've taken that negative belief that they've stated to us earlier on, and we are now going to replace that with a positive belief. So when they think about the traumatic event or the traumatic image or memory, we want them to now be able to associate that event and not with the negative cognition anymore, but with the positive one that they have identified here. And so there's many examples of positive and negative cognitions that can be used as examples to support clients in choosing the statement that describes their beliefs best. However, most of the examples given or that you can find on Google are not racially focused or specific enough to potentially allow for the best fit. So here are some examples of what that could look like. And these are just a few examples. There are many others, and they don't inherently need to go with the pairing that I have them with on the screen. More so just giving you some examples of what that can look like. And we really want to support grounding affirmation in identity, in the way that they see themselves, in the way that they see themselves within a larger system, whether that be their community or outside of their immediate communities. And the next slide, please. So the last phase that I want to talk about, I skipped the 6th phase of body scan, but I do want to talk quickly about ways to integrate racially focused interventions used in the closure step. So specifically the development of the safe space and the grounding techniques, we would have developed those and identified those in step 4. But when we use them actively in the closing stage here, we can support clients in developing their safe space by asking questions that focus on the cultural wealth that communities have long relied on and exploring how that can be integrated in what clients picture in their safe space. We can also integrate music as part of the closure or even as part of the start of EMDR as a means of grounding. So if there are songs that are important to the client, we could always start the session with those songs, allow them to become comfortable and get acclimated with the session, with therapy, with their bodies in those moments as they're about to embark on something that could be really triggering or really opening for them. And then we can close the sessions the same way by turning on that song or a different song, something that means something to them, so that we can support closing them in a way that feels safest for them. So we can move to the last slide and open the dialogue here for any questions or comments that you all have. Thank you for having me.
I don't have any questions right now, but I do want to just thank you for all your information. EMDR is the next step for me, and I have been putting it off because I'm scared of it. So it's been nice getting a little more information about it, even if it's like the race part doesn't apply to me, but the information that you've given us so far. So I thank you for that.
Thank you. I appreciate that.
Dylan.
Yeah, sorry for all the questions today. When you talk about beginning the process and the movie poster concept, that's to establish the area or the topic or experience that they've experienced and that you want to address through EMDR. But when you're actually in the process with the bilateral stimulation and um, are you still just working in terms of the movie poster, or are you inventorying and going and mining the experience further?
So when a client identifies the movie poster, so to speak, what they're identifying for you is the image that represents the most traumatic part of that memory. And that becomes the image that we focus on as part of the EMDR processing for the entirety of the desensitization. Now, in recent traumatic event protocol, that's a little bit different. This is where they are actually going to walk you through the story and we're going to stop at each point of distress. Now, that's not typical for when we're pulling the memories from history. And so we do focus on that image until that image is no longer causing the same disruptive response and the same disruptive symptoms. So once we've kind of cleared the channel, so to speak, and they reach zero where they're no longer disrupted, that's when we're going into those latter steps. That's when we're making sure that that doesn't start to reoccur later on, whether that be later on in therapy or in that session that you're in.
Thank you. I
Does that
appreciate your clarification. I dealt with a malfeasant, reckless practitioner when I was experiencing EMDR, and none of these cautions were taken. And so this has given me a little bit more hope to pursue it as a clinician in the future myself. So thank you.
Yeah, I'm really hopeful that you can find a better experience, and I'm sorry that you didn't have a good one. This is not the intervention to be a little less careful with.
Thank you.
I have kind of a follow-up question to Dylan's question. How long have you found patients stay in that stage? Like, is it a quick turnaround? Does it sometimes take a lot longer than, like, what's typical?
So when you're talking about desensitization with one particular image,
Mm-hmm.
so it really does depend and vary. I've plenty of clients in the work with them where in one session we're able to desensitize at least one target. In other scenarios, it's been maybe more than one, and in others, we take that one target and it takes two sessions, maybe three. Um, Now, when we think about like a float back intervention, which is essentially, let's say they gave me something more recent, within, let's say, 5 years. And we take the feeling from that, and then I'm going to float back with them to different time periods of their life where they felt a similar feeling. We're going to get back to the earliest one that they can find, and we start there. Now that takes several sessions, right? Because we're doing target one, all of
Mm-hmm.
the phases. Then we're going to target two, all the phases. And essentially, once we get all the way back to this one and they've all went to zero, we run it through one more time just to make sure we're still at zero. And so something like that, when we're looking at 3 or 4 targets in a float back, it's not usually more than that. We don't want to get excessive. Um, we can be looking at something like that being done in 2, 3, 4 sessions. Depends on the client, maybe 5. But there's no
And do
right
you
or wrong
just,
to that.
sorry,
Sorry.
no, you're okay. Do you disclose like all of the traumatic events that you're wanting to work through at like in the beginning, or is this something that you work through like as you go along?
So let's say I've started work with a client that they come in, they're so excited. I want to do MGR. And I'm like, okay, let's talk about it, right? And we talk about what it is. And typically they want to jump right in, like I said.
Mhm.
So If we talk about what skills they have, coping skills, if they have a lot of positive resources and all of that, great. We can jump into that earlier. But if not, it's kind of about educating and pacing. Like, hey, it is my number one priority that when we're done with this session, you're safe.
Mhm.
And this is what that looks like first, right? Building those skills up. And so when we do get to the part of desensitization, it's me and they're like, "Oh man, where do I start? There's so many." I say, "Well, we have a couple of options. We can start with the biggest ones if you're like, yeah, these are so persistent in my life. Or we can start with ones that feel lighter and we can see how it goes and give the client the choice because some of them want the deep end and some of them are like, kiddie pool, please. And that's fine. But essentially, we get them there, and I'll say, all right, give me your top three targets and try to prevent them from giving me their top three narratives. Remember, I just want the movie poster, right?
Mhm.
And so then they'll
Yep.
give me those, and we'll kind of decipher from there what is best to start with based on what they're looking for, based on what's going on in their life. How regulated are you in life right now? How safe do you feel? And maybe let that lead which target we start with and then go to next.
Okay, thank you.
Jessica, I'm going to read. There's a couple of questions in the chat. The first one is, what recommendations do you have for seeking training?
Training. There's so many trainings out there. I was actually looking for the one that I did so I could recommend it. But they've changed their program a bit, and the trainers that I had that were so wonderful, they're not necessarily associated with that facility anymore. But I will say that when you're looking for EMDR training, if the training is not $1,500 or more, you're probably not getting really trained. For example, PESI offers EMDR trainings that are like 300. That's not it. We want to get the full one, and we want to make sure that they are EMDRIA approved, so EMDRIA approved. That's the board that regulates if you were to go all the way into being fully credentialed through EMDR. That is the system that you would use. So you would have to have went through approved trainings from them. And I'm not knocking PESI. I've attended some PESI trainings, but I will say that I don't think they say EMDRIA approved. So just be mindful not to waste your money when money is precious in this economy.
And the second question is, with more recent events related to the socio-political climate and ICE raids, would EMDR be supportive with that ongoing destabilization threat?
That's a great question. So when we are thinking about doing EMDR for anything that's considered disruptive or traumatic, we want to essentially make sure that we're looking at what are those current responses from the client doing for them? Do they need to be that reactive? Do they need to be that hypervigilant based on where they are? Would desensitization potentially cause them more harm depending on what spaces they're in? So that kind of brings me back to the court case, right? While at some point it's going to be great to reduce how reactive you are to past traumatic memories, if we're in the middle of a court case and we're trying to essentially prove our experience, if we are not reactive in the eye of public opinion, we may not win that case, right? And so I do think that the way people experience racism and fear relating to the current political climate, relating to ICE raids, and whether it be current racism or past, while I do think those things will have a space in EMDR, we need to think about how hypervigilant or aware does that client need to be right now, and let that lead the safety conversation first when making that decision. I hope that answers your question and makes sense. If not, please let me know.
I have a couple more for you, Jessica.
Okay.
Have you ever had a client that could not recognize the source of their headaches, stomach aches, or anxiety? And how would you address the symptoms?
Mhm. So that's what's great about doing somatic EMDR and having that training is that I don't necessarily need you to have the memory. While if there's one that comes up or is associated, then great. But what we can do through EMDR or even other somatic practices that are not EMDR is we can reduce the severity of symptoms. And that's often really surprising or feels really simple, um, or sounds simple rather, until it's done. And then it's like, oh, that's really helpful. And now for chronic pain and chronic conditions, there is actually EMDR for chronic pain. There is an EMDR for chronic pain protocol. There is EMDR for addiction. There's EMDR for all sorts of things that can be really helpful to tailor to client needs. And I, by no means, touched on all of those interventions today. So there's different things out there.
Another person asks, what are some of the concrete techniques to teach clients to help protect themselves from full flashbacks during EMDR sessions, putting themselves into the role of the observer, etc.?
So trying to prevent them from having a full flashback in the session, is that the
Yes.
question? Okay. Um, so we're really not going to be able to be in control, so to speak, of what the brain does or essentially what the client does. There's plenty of times and plenty of sessions where I can instruct a client to focus on an image and they keep trying to tell me the story and they keep running through the story instead of focusing on the image, right? And so in those cases, we tend to stop and talk about, what emotions are coming up for them. Is there something that's causing you to feel really uncomfortable? Do we have the urge to run? Are we feeling like we want to wiggle out, right? Because what do thoughts do? What does rumination do? It protects you. It keeps you protected in that logical space from having to access the emotions and the physical pain that comes with it. And so the brain is going to do what the brain is going to do. But if a client is struggling to stay focused or grounded, I'm going to quote unquote pull them out. We're not going to keep trying to dive into something that they're already kind of scrambling, quicksanding around, so that we can reduce those symptoms and we can use closure and we can use their container, which is not a intervention I detailed in this presentation here, but a container to put away certain feelings or thoughts or flashbacks that they're having to ground themselves in the moment, and we come back to it in another session.
Anyone else have any more questions? Well, thank you everybody for coming. Jessica, thank you for coming and sharing this with us. This was a great presentation. You all, I posted the attendance sheet in the chat, so please go ahead and sign that if you haven't. So I'll just drop it in one more time just in case. We have one more seminar to go in our series. We have parts work in about 2 weeks from now. Dan Simo is going to talk to us about parts work in the clinical practice realm. So please join us if you can. And have a good night, everybody. Thank you for coming. Really appreciate you sharing your night with us. And thank
Thank
you,
you so
Jessica.
much. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you.